I'll give you a quick handout with some guiding questions for something I want you to watch in the second half of what we're going to do today. But first, we want to go through this with you. In a minute, I'm going to give you, or at the end of the class, I'm going to give you a handout for your next big project. Next big project. The project is not due until April 14th. So you're going to have 2 weeks to do what ultimately is going to be a research paper, basically. But we're going to do it in stages, and it builds on things that some of which you've already talked about, some of which we're starting to talk about today. So I want to give it to you today, even though it's not due for 2 weeks in terms of the overall project. We're actually doing multiple things at one time. We're doing multiple things at one time, and so you should start to see how it all fits together, including a lot of the things we covered in the first half of this class should be much more helpful to you as you now use these theories, these ideas, these readings for what we're doing now. So I want you to start to see how it all fits together, both specifically and generally. But in terms of big projects, we have this big research project on the Great Migration that I'm going to say more about, which we'll be working on. And the final exam are the two big things we have left. And then we have smaller sort of components, ability to get points, those sorts of things. But I want you to think about the big picture as well as the small picture moving forward. Hopefully that will mean that I can talk less during the second half of the class. I've been talking too much, but that's been necessary in order to sort of set up some of the discussions and the issues that we're trying to deal with, especially now moving forward, set up some of the discussions and debates I want to have as well around these issues. So be thinking big picture, be thinking specifics. In terms of big picture, we're going to look at the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance, these things that come out of it, civil rights, quote-unquote, 60s, and contemporary America. Right? We're already in the 20th century, so this whole second half of the class really sticks to exploring the 20th century, 21st century world, African-American history in the 21st century. Because we were able to cover so much the first half of the class, that's now possible. In terms of where you are, right? If you are caught up with the syllabus reading, you're up to chapter 16, which covers the Harlem Renaissance. If you're not quite there yet, that's okay. But you're going to want to make sure to stay as caught up as possible as we move forward. Moving forward a little more quickly in some of these things. Today I want to actually talk a little bit about this chapter. 14 and 15 really overlap with one another. 14 is specifically about World War I and its impact on African Americans. Chapter 15 is really about what they call the progressive era in American history, which is really the same time period. This time period with World War I. So a lot of the stuff you're going to notice overlaps. And then chapter 16 is really on the Harlem Renaissance era, which is right around the 1920s. So all three chapters really deal with about a 20-year period of time. But they're all important and they all sort of talk to one another. And all three of those chapters will help you do this project on the Great Migration. So that's why we're raising it now. That's why we're raising it now. Really quickly, in terms of the Great Migration, if you do a quick Google search on the Great Migration, you'll get a bunch of statistics and information. There have been actually several different Great Migrations in world history, people moving from one area to another. Obviously, we're looking at the African American Great Migration in this country. So if you do a search of African American Great Migration, you might get a statistic that says something like between 1910 and 1970, 6 million African Americans leave the South. Big number, 6 million leave the South. Now in this class, I've probably given you the statistic 10, 15 times that by the 1890s, 90% of African Americans still live in the South. By 1900, 90% of African Americans still live in the South. What's interesting is that as a result of the Great Migration that you're going to be studying in more detail, that's going to change. So you go from the 1900 having 90+% African Americans that live still in the South to after that, the majority of African Americans live outside the South. How does that happen? Why does that happen? Well, that's part of what we need to look at. That's why that migration is a great migration, because it's so dramatic. It changes things so dramatically. It really starts with World War I. Right, that's a big span of time, 1910 to 1970. So we got to break that up and look at these various waves of migration. It's going to start with World War I. So obviously World War I is significant in some way. I'm going to point out some things about Chapter 14, World War I right now. We'll see how that leads to migration, and then we'll look at some specific examples of that. So what we're doing now is looking at the new Negro. The new Negro. Spent a lot of time before the break looking at the old Negro. What is this old Negro? Particularly the Ethnic Notions video was good at showing you what that old Negro looked like, right? Sambo, Coon, Mammy, Jezebel, all these kind of caricatures, all these negative stereotypes of African Americans. Those were all old Negroes. Then we moved on to look at the whole debate between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, that in many ways was about moving away from that old Negro and putting a new Negro in his place. Well, what is this new Negro going to look like? Now what we're seeing, to put it bluntly, you're going to see a number of people that really want to kill the old Negro. I'm not talking about lynch mobs. I'm talking about African Americans that want to kill this idea of what the old Negro is and put some new Negro in its place. They have different visions of themselves, and they're going to do various things to replace those old stereotypes with something much more positive. World War I is going to be huge in that process. World War I is going to be huge in that process of kind of killing the old Negro. Now we saw, in many ways, both Washington and Du Bois were trying to kill that old Negro. Washington is saying, how do you get rid of this old Negro? Well, work hard. If your stereotype is lazy, work hard and prove yourself. Du Bois is going to say, no, you need to fight and get your right to vote and these sorts of things. That both of those strategies, you could argue, were designed to kill the old Negro. Well, what happens when millions of people start doing that? What we're going to see is a new Negro movement, as it's called. Now, that takes us directly to the Great Migration. It takes us directly to the Harlem Renaissance. You could argue that takes us directly to the whole Civil Rights movement. Because now you have millions of people that are unwilling to be these old Negroes, that are willing to literally fight and die if they need to for the rights that they feel are theirs. So normally when you hear that term new Negro, it's used interchangeably with the Harlem Renaissance. You've probably heard of that term, the Harlem Renaissance. Sometimes it's called the New Negro Movement. Usually talks about the period right around the 1920s when there's a huge outgrowth of African American culture, art, writing, plays, books, all these paintings, all these artistic projects that explode right around the 1920s. We're going to talk about that part of the New Negro, the New Negro movement, or Harlem Renaissance as it's called. In some ways, though, that term Harlem Renaissance is a mistake because it makes it sound like this is only happening in Harlem, New York. That there were only writers and artists in Harlem, New York. Now, that's not true. Harlem does become this kind of capital of Black America, as it was called by the 1920s, right? As a result of this great migration, you got hundreds of thousands of people go to New York, Black people, and make a community in Harlem. But that wasn't the only place this was happening. In fact, a generation before Harlem becomes, quote-unquote, the capital of Black America, many people said that Washington, D.C. was the capital of Black America. There was an even earlier Renaissance here. So what we want to do is see how these different communities are going to be exploding positively at the same time. This whole new Negro era comes out of that. So what you should be thinking about is, what does this new Negro look like? More specifically, what does a new Negro man look like? And what does a new Negro woman look like? We're going to look at examples of both today and into next class. Right? You get a bunch of individuals saying, no, this is now what a Black man is. This is what a Black woman is. And in some ways, looking at the specifics will help you understand this bigger idea about a new Negro. But again, a lot of it comes out of World War I, so this is why I'm starting with this. World War I is huge. Huge topic. There are whole classes just on World War I, which at that point was called the Great War. Right? We didn't know there was going to be a World War II 30 years later. that was even bigger than World War I, so it was initially called the Great War. Now we call it World War I because it was a World War II. Bloodiest war in world history to this point. Bloodiest war in world history. This is why it's called this Great or World War. Between 1914 and 1918, in those 4 years, 10 million people are going to die. 10 million people are going to get killed in those 4 years. Europe is largely destroyed. Why? All because one guy got shot. To put it bluntly. One guy in Europe got shot in June 1914, June 28th, in fact, 1914. By August 1914, the entire world is at war. By 1918, 10 million people are dead. One guy gets shot, the Archduke of a small foreign country in Europe. It ignites tensions that were already in Europe, and the world goes to war. It's a bloodbath. 10 million people dead. Soldiers, civilians, the world's going to be forever changed by this. The U.S. finds itself involved in this conflict eventually, not right away. So obviously we're more interested in the U.S., not necessarily the entire world. But think about World War I is a huge tipping point in world history. We're interested in the U.S., we're interested in its impact on African Americans more specifically. So that's where we'll focus, and that's where chapter 14 spends its attention. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, just to kind of give you a sense of what it's about, and then we'll use it to transition into what I want to look at more specifically today. I said World War I starts in 1914. The U.S. doesn't enter the war for 3 years. We're kind of late to the party. And that was intentional. The U.S. wants to distance itself from Europe. Europe seems to be always at war in this period, and Americans are like, you know what? We got an ocean in between us and them. Let them deal with their own foolishness. We don't want to be involved in this world war. So initially, we aren't. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson, that we mentioned before the break, remember Wilson was the one that showed Birth of a Nation in the White House, right? We got a lot of protests because of that. Wilson is president still during this point. In fact, he gets reelected, Woodrow Wilson does, in 1916, largely because of his promise to keep the U.S. out of this war. He runs on, his campaign is largely, I kept us out of the war, I'll keep us out of the war again. If you elect somebody else, you might end up in war. Americans are like, you know what, that sounds good to us. They re-elect him in 1916. Within a year, we're at war. He did not want to go into the war. In many ways, the U.S. kind of gets dragged into this conflict because of various things that happened, especially by Germany. But that was, the kind of American feeling at the times that we should stay out of this war. But now we find ourselves in it. 1917, we declare war. How is that going to impact the home front? How is it going to impact African Americans in particular? Point out a couple things here. Selective Service Act. Some of you should have heard that phrase before. Selective Service Act. Especially the males in the room, that may resonate for you. What's a Selective Service Act? Or what's selective service? When you register for selective service, what does that mean? You got to do it to get financial aid. If you're an 18-year-old male, you got to do it on various government documents when you turn 18. What's selective service?
I think when you said 18, you got signed something that said you got to go to war that they can draft.
Exactly. Yes, it's the law that facilitates the draft. So when you turn 18 years old, if you're a male in this country, you got to sign up for selective service. If we go to war, we get attacked, all of a sudden they say it's a draft. You could get drafted and have to fight for your country, all that kind of stuff. In some countries, men and women fight in, Israel, I believe, is one country where everybody fights, I think, 2 years, males and females. In this country, it's just males that in terms of being drafted, everyone obviously can enlist. We've seen changes around gender. But initially, this was considered a male kind of thing. We're also going to see about the women's contribution to the war effort, which is very, very important in this period, too. So selective service, that's what that means. So basically, it's supposed to be a democratic way. Right? If your country goes to war, everybody should contribute to the war effort. That's the idea. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, famous or not, you might get drafted. That's the idea. Selective service. Now, the U.S. had problems with this in past wars. Right? In past wars, this had been an issue, especially because of race and gender. So the Civil War, for example, there were various ways to get out of fighting. Now, if you had $300 or $3,000, you could buy your way out. If you got drafted, I don't want to go, here's $3,000, I'm good. Right? A lot of poor people are like, wait a second, we don't have that kind of money, so we can't buy our way out. Is this just a rich man's war? Right? So this causes tensions. This is supposed to deal with all that. Right? This is supposed to deal with all that so that it's equal for everyone. So when the U.S. enters the war in April 1917, the Selective Service Act is passed in May 1917, supposedly with no racial restrictions. So supposedly, again, everyone is going to contribute to the war effort equally. Initially, though, people see that there seem to be some problems around this, especially race. African Americans disproportionately represented in the draft. So, say black people are only 10% of the population. Some folks say, why are they 30% of the Army? Are they being drafted more because they're African American? This is going to be an issue in later wars as well. Around Vietnam, a lot of folks would have problems with the statistics about the draft. Some thought it was being used for racist means, that they draft all these black people and then send them to the front. And they draft poor whites as well. The poor whites are being disproportionately drafted. So you see fewer exemptions based on race, based on marriage and children. If you were married, or if you're the only provider for a child, there's supposed to be some ways out of it at this point, if that didn't seem to be the case. So some people start to say, wait a second, what's going on? This is not a fair war. In addition, those that get drafted encounter some issues, right? A lot of what I want you to see here, you're going to see some images in a second, are some of the images of the soldiers. Right? What better way to kill this idea of the old Negro than a black soldier? Nice uniform, well presented, manly. In certain ways, you're going to see some images of that as well. But there are going to be some problems for these folks once they get in the Army. Now, Woodrow Wilson is walking around making speeches about how this war is going to be a turning point, tipping point in world history. Woodrow Wilson says this is going to be the war to end all wars. He says if we're going to fight, we avoided it for 3 years. If we're going to fight, let this be the last time we do this. Right, this should be the war to end all wars. We're going to put some things in place, like the League of Nations, now the United Nations, that's supposed to stop wars forever. Right? As we know, that didn't happen. Right? Within 30 years, there's going to be an even bigger world war. But that was how Wilson sort of sold it. It's going to be the war to end all wars. We're going to fight to make the world safe for democracy. African Americans hear all this and they're like, wow, okay, if we're going to fight to make the world safe for democracy, that must mean we're going to have democracy at home too. We'll stop all this lynching. Maybe I'll be able to vote. So think about how these messages are going to be received by African Americans in particular. Yet, once they get into the Army, it's a racist army. It's a Jim Crow army. Right, so you have units of all black soldiers led by white officers for the most part. Some people are like, wait a second, how are we going to fight for democracy when we're not even considered equal in the Army? So this is going to be an ongoing problem. Black men are rejected for officers' commissions. There are many that say that these black men are not intelligent enough to be officers, to be leaders. They're going to have to fight to try to overcome that. The NAACP involves itself in the conflict. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the leaders of the NAACP, is pretty central to this. NAACP says, wait a second, what is the deal with this whites-only policy? How are you going to only have white officer training for? Right? How do you only have white officers? Especially if many of those whites don't like African Americans. You're going to put them in charge of a regiment of black folks. How are they going to treat them or mistreat them? Are they going to tell them to go march at these machine guns? Because they don't care what happens to them if they're these racist folks. Right? So many people are having a problem seeing the war as an opportunity to deal with some of these issues of race. And then the NAACP is central to that. They push for the establishment of black officers training camps. They say, okay, if black soldiers are going to fight, they should have black officers too. Blacks eventually are commissioned starting in Des Moines in October 1917. So you see some progress along these lines in terms of dealing with the racism and the discrimination in the armed forces, even before they can get abroad to fight. This guy, Emmett Scott, a couple of significant or interesting points about Mr. Emmett Scott. Emmett Scott is a black man who's appointed special assistant to the Secretary of War. and appointed special assistant to the secretary, where his job is to give advice about how do we deal with these black soldiers. We need their service, but we don't really want them to get too ahead of themselves. We want them to kind of stay in their place. How do we deal with them? Emmett Scott, interestingly, his background, Emmett Scott was the personal assistant and secretary to Booker T. Washington. He takes over at Tuskegee when Washington dies in 1915, right before World War I. So think about how powerful Washington, the Tuskegee machine was. Emmett Scott will kind of pick up on that, right? He's seen as a major figure, a major leader. His advice was, just apply the law equally. You got the Selective Service Act, just apply it equally. Stop applying it in racist ways. He also formulates plans to raise the morale of black soldiers, try to keep them happy so that they continue to support the war effort. Because this is a major question, right? A lot of soldiers might think, why am I fighting for a country that isn't giving me the same rights I'm fighting for? Why am I going to fight for democracy in France and I don't have democracy in Mississippi? So this is an issue that has to be dealt with. Some of this we've seen before, right? Training black soldiers in domestic camps and how that could become problematic. Right? Some of the communities surrounding these training areas for black soldiers don't really want a whole bunch of black men running around with uniforms and guns, right? We'll talk about how that becomes an issue in Houston riot, that comes up here in a second. Troops-based discrimination from the Army and from agencies that serve it. They're expected to serve in the Jim Crow Army, and especially from these white civilians. Yet, these new Negroes are not kind of willing to take this mistreatment line down. For many, being a new Negro meant that you didn't deal with the stuff that the old Negroes dealt with. Right? Say it's 1919, the end of World War I. If you were 30 years old in 1919, that meant you were born in 1889. You were never a slave. Right? Your viewpoint of the world is going to look very different than perhaps your parents or your grandparents. Maybe live through slavery and see progress slowly coming. You're like, wait a second, I'm fighting abroad, I'm risking my life, and I don't have the same rights here. So these new Negroes are seen as impatient and more militant. Houston, we talked about that Houston riot actually before the break. That came up in chapter 12. Raised African American soldiers. I think the corporal or lieutenant, their leader, gets beaten up by police, goes back to the base, and he's upset. And his soldiers are upset too. They go looking for folks. They actually open fire on the police station. The cops that had beaten them up. 5 white cops get killed. They say, look, we're training to use guns. Let's practice. They really involved and said it turns into a huge riot. This is where Roosevelt condemns them. 19 of them are executed, in fact. Again, these are soldiers. So they're not really sort of willing to deal with the same sort of things. This example of the Black 15th New York Infantry is interesting as well. You got these soldiers from New York that enlist. They're getting trained down in South Carolina. So they're not really familiar with all the sort of deep South, Jim Crow rules. And folks are acting crazy, especially the neighborhood communities. They can't go get food, right? And eventually it leads to tension. Events happen, they want to retaliate, they're eventually sent to Europe to avoid another incident like the Houston riot. Right? They say, so ship them off the war, get them out of here. What happens with the soldiers that get abroad? It's going to be really interesting, right? When you travel abroad, it broadens your horizon. It changes your view of the world. If you've never left Bowie, nothing necessarily wrong with that. But what do you have to compare it to? Right? You've never left D.C., it's hard to compare it to something. But if you leave D.C. and go to New York or go to France, and you get treated differently as what happens to these soldiers, they get to Europe, they get to France, and they're treated, their heads explode. They're treated so much differently in many ways. They have to really think about how they're treated back home. The 369th, for example, both positively and negatively. Both positively and negatively, the treatment is going to change their worldview. So the 369th are some of the first to go overseas and fight. Now, in some ways, they might be mistreated. So from July 1918 on to the end of the war, they're in continuous action. They're in continuous danger. They're at the front. Now, normally you want to rotate troops out. You might go for a couple of weeks and then rotate back, and somebody else takes your place in the most dangerous areas, because it's hard, both physically and mentally, to be at the front that long. These guys are pretty much thrown into it. It's deadly. It's difficult. They end up being the first and longest serving regiments assigned to support a foreign army. So again, think about the old Negro. Stereotypes of the Sambos: he's cowardly, right, lazy, he wouldn't fight. These soldiers are disproving that just by their participation in the war. You're going to see some images of them here in a second. Other units will do the same thing. They get medals for their valor abroad, particularly by other countries. Look at this picture. The Black American Buffalo soldiers of the 367th Infantry, 77th Division in France. What do you notice about that picture? First thing, there's uniforms. Right? These guys are not stoop-shouldered, big-eyed. There's not a Sambo there. There's not an old Negro there. These are definitely new Negroes in terms of the image they're presenting. These black men. What else do you notice about this picture taken in France during World War I that might be striking for the time period? Yeah, it's a little white girl with them. You would not see that picture of a bunch of black men with a little white girl on their lap in Mississippi in 1917, right? It's kind of thing that gets you lynched. So it's interesting to think about how they're treating, how they're interacting, how the color line doesn't work the same way, particularly in France. Now, France is a really interesting sort of place for a lot of these soldiers. Many of them fight in France. Some of them fight in support of the French army, even before the American army really wanted to sort of let them fight. Many of them are going to fight for the French. You'll see a couple of images of that here in a second. But their experience in France are really mind-blowing. A lot of soldiers wrote letters home about this place is great, man. Some of them don't want to come home. They feel free for the first time. The French welcome them as heroes, right? France is our allies, and we're helping liberate France, essentially. We're seen as heroes. Now, there were some racial stereotypes, right? These stereotypes don't just stay in the U.S. So, for example, some soldiers talk about how French civilians, when they first got there, they're saying, "Hooray! Thank you for coming." And then some of the French folks tell them, hey, turn around real quick. You're like, what? Yeah, just turn around. I need to see something. Okay, turn around. The other French people are like, oh. So the soldier's like, what's up? What's going on? The French people say, we heard you guys had tails. We thought you had tails. Some of the stereotypes of African Americans were that, again, we were animals, we had tails. They're like, you guys don't have tails. They're like, no. Right? So there are some stereotypes that have to be overcome, but for the most part, these soldiers talk about how free they feel in France. Some of them date white women. French women love them. They're like, this is a whole different, why is this not the way the U.S. feels? So it's interesting to think about how your travel and going abroad might make you rethink your position at home. This is a picture of the decoration of African American soldiers. This often happened, especially by the French army. Many of the soldiers get some of the highest honors in the French army, the War Cross and other things. At the same time, they're being discriminated against in the U.S. Army. If they're allowed to fight, they're often forced to dig latrines and these sorts of things rather than be allowed to actually use their skills. And many have to fight for the right to fight. Yet, in support of European armies, they're being treated as equals for the most part. German propaganda plays into this as well. Some soldiers talk about how the German troops, the 92nd Division in particular, talk about how these leaflets will be dropped on them. These little small pamphlets, basically, are dropped on them by the German army. And the German army is like, hey, why are you guys fighting us? Why are you shooting at us? Why are you supporting the U.S. Army when you don't even have the right to vote back home? You're fighting for democracy in Germany. You don't have democracy in Mississippi. You can think about how that might make some sense, right? Soldiers might be like, dang. Make a good point. Why are you fighting for a country that lynches you? You read about the race riot back home today? These sorts of things, the Germans said we can use that and maybe make these guys desert. Promise them liberty, democracy, equality if they come over to the German side. They don't. They remain patriotic, but it's interesting to think about that. My uncle, a veteran of Vietnam, talks about the same thing happening in the Vietnam War. Said that they had leaflets dropped on their positions. They had these megaphones and speakers blasting out these messages. Black soldiers, come on over here, right? You don't need to be shooting us. You don't have the right to vote in your own country. Why are you fighting us? Very famously, Muhammad Ali talks about why he didn't want to fight for the war, his religious beliefs, and he says, no, Viet Cong ever called me a nigger. Why would I go fight them? Gets him in some trouble back here in the U.S. in the 1960s. Same sorts of things were happening in this period. Slander campaigns as well. A number of stereotypical media portrayals of American black soldiers, severely criticized if they lost any battle. But the cultural experiences are particularly important. They're abroad or in France. Some of the cultural experiences, again, we're going to see explode even later into things like the Harlem Renaissance. So, for example, most combat units had their own band. You'll see a picture here of Lieutenant James Reese Europe, black soldier, also leader of a band. He's going to be one of the folks that helps bring back an innovative form of jazz back to the U.S., right? Bring jazz to Europe as well. When you think about things like the Harlem Renaissance that exploded after the war, a lot of it has to do with events during the war. Get women's war work, women supporting the war effort in various capacities, even if it's not at the front or as soldiers in this sense, and women have to fight for the right to vote as well. We're going to see women's support of the war in many different ways here in some of these images. A couple more coming in a second. Move to some of these. We've already talked about. Coming home, what's going to happen when these soldiers come back home? Right, how can you go abroad and fight and kill Europeans and then come back and expect you to be the same? You're not going to be the same. Folks knew that they were not going to be the same. Some whites worried that habits developed in France would be detrimental to interracial stability when the troops return home. So these soldiers that dated French women, what happens when they come back to Alabama? Still think that's going to be okay? A lot of folks are nervous about that. So although the troops are received enthusiastically as heroes initially when they come home, there's also increasing problems, especially for black soldiers that come back. Right? They come back to a very conservative society. They come back to a racial backlash. Right? For example, race riots. Bloody summer of 1919, one of the bloodiest summers in American history, happens at the conclusion of World War I, in part because these soldiers come back and they're like, wait a second, we're not going to deal with the same stuff we used to deal with. These are new Negroes that come back. So some folks say, lynch them, right? Race riots are necessary to put them back in their place. So how is this going to impact the home country? Woodrow Wilson made a number of promises. African Americans have supported this war effort in part because of a lot of the promises that are made for democracy and equality. We talked about how Africa had been colonized. Right? In the 1880s, Africa gets carved up. Wilson and others say, you know what, we're going to get rid of colonies. And so black people here and abroad are like, this is great. We had African soldiers supporting the war effort of France and Britain and some of our allies, thinking that in part it's going to get them their independence. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. What ends up happening is the losing European powers like Germany lose their colonies to Britain and France on the winning side. But it does not mean the independence of African countries and other countries, Caribbean and elsewhere. So black people are looking at this and saying, look, these things that we were promised were false promises. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the folks that had supported the war effort. Remember, Du Bois had said African Americans have to support the war effort. We need to close ranks with our white brothers and fight, and then after the war, we'll get all these things, we'll be accepted as equals. It doesn't happen. So Du Bois says, Woodrow Wilson, you lied to us. Has the world forgotten the Congo? So Du Bois had written this article called Close Ranks, saying that African Americans should close ranks, fight the war, and then come back and deal with these issues. After the war, he says, we left fighting, we need to return fighting. Right? So we fight abroad for democracy, now let's come home and fight for it here. And many of these soldiers are going to do just that. This encounter of African Americans, Caribbeans, and African Americans during the war is particularly important. We started off this class talking about definitions of African American, black identity, all that, trying to complicate it, right? The war is going to be a huge turning point in rethinking black identity, rethinking racism, white supremacy. We've got African American soldiers from New York and Mississippi that go abroad to places like France, meet black people in Europe, meet black soldiers from Africa, meet black soldiers from the Caribbean that are supporting the war effort, and they start talking. They're like, wait a second, you guys have racism there too? You guys have colonialism? We all seem to be in the same situation. So folks really start rethinking blackness. Why is it that blacks all over the world, not just the U.S., seem to be suffering similar things? So when we talk about someone like a Marcus Garvey next time, right, his ideas of Pan-Africanism, that all black people have something in common and should come together. These ideas explode during World War I. People are rethinking blackness. They come back to the home front, and it's a very conservative kind of backlash here. Chapter 14 tells us a lot about this. I don't feel the need to really go into it, but a lot of it has to do with the fear of communism through Russia spreading here. So anytime you challenge the government, you're seen as influenced by communists in Russia. Du Bois and others would be branded as communists in this period. So the chapter talks a lot about the kind of crackdown that would happen during and after the war. Black exodus. This kind of takes us to the migration. Exodus is people leaving. Thousands of African Americans moved from the south into northern cities. Now we've seen before African Americans leaving the South in some numbers. We talk about during Reconstruction. As soon as slavery ends, a lot of folks say, I'm out. Where are you going? I'm going north. Try to get a better job, or I'm going to connect with family. So we've seen people leaving before. But this number is going to explode during the war. Great migration of African Americans really starts during World War I. In part for economic reasons. Suddenly, if you had 8 million soldiers abroad, mostly men sent abroad, right? All of a sudden there's 8 million jobs. Especially in the north, especially in factories, good paying jobs. So African Americans in the South doing things like picking cotton 16 hours a day for 10 cents an hour. All of a sudden a factory owner says, hey, you want a job making $1 an hour? You're like, yes. He actually had folks come down and recruit African Americans to go north and start working in factories. Sometimes working in jobs they weren't allowed to work before. So World War I opens up a number of opportunities. It's not surprising that the folks are going to start streaming out of the South. For women as well. Most of these factory jobs were seen as male-only jobs. But now these males, especially working-age males, are gone. You need women. Women step right up, step into these factories, and start doing things like building bombs, building tanks. Think about the impact that's going to have. Traditional definitions of womanhood, right, are feminine, they're soft, they're not strong, they can't do this difficult type of work. They need to do women's work, like in the kitchen. Right? All of a sudden, all these women are like, no, I'm building machine guns. I'm making $3 an hour, which is good money. And it changes how women are looking at themselves. Some of these women say, you know what, why should I marry some guy that makes 50 cents a day? I got a job making $5. I don't need him. So now maybe there's a sense of independence for these women. At the same time you have a new Negro movement, you're going to have a new women's movement. These women say, wait a second, we supported the war effort, why can't we vote? It's not surprising that the 19th Amendment, right, women's suffrage, passes right around 1919, 1920, in about a year, year and a half of the end of World War I. This war has tremendous changes for both African Americans and other folks. So economic reasons, we'll get much more into that as we do this project on migration, but keep that in mind. World War I is going to really impact this. Many opportunities, especially for African Americans, especially in industrial employment, factories, get you out of the fields, cotton fields maybe for the first time. National Urban League, you've probably heard of the National Urban League before. It's a major organization founded in 1910 that's supposed to help ease the adjustment for all these migrants that are coming north to urban areas. So you got thousands of folks coming from Mississippi, Alabama, right, from the cotton fields to places like New York, Chicago, D.C., Baltimore, more urban areas, cities, factories, and a lot of them have culture shock. They're used to the field, and they see skyscrapers now. They're dealing with all the urban problems that are, cities are not great places at this time. They're dirty, it's hard to get services. So the Urban League will help this adjustment Again, we'll see more of this in terms of how folks are going to adjust to their new homes in the north and urban areas in particular. Blacks try to join unions. In some respects, they're allowed to join unions. In many respects, they're not allowed because of racism. A lot of unions will accept African Americans. But for some, this is a major turning point. Because unions mean better wages, better working conditions, better jobs. This is a flyer from the period, new jobs for women. You can't really see it probably, especially if it's all way in the back. Some of these are the chapter notes. Says everyone is getting, the first one says everyone is getting used to overall the women's in the machine shop. So it's a picture of women in overalls, traditionally these male-looking clothing, working, good paying jobs. The second one down here says clerical work, quite a new job for Negro girls. Clerical work, so like typing, black women in these huge rooms typing out things. This is professional work. You're not picking cotton, now you're typing. You're a professional in a sense, much better money. This one says the war brought us women traffic cops and mail carriers, right? So women working in jobs that have traditionally been reserved for men. African Americans working in jobs that traditionally have been reserved for whites. It says women that made good as streetcar conductors and elevator operators. Maya Angelou was one of the first streetcar conductors in World War II, in fact, in San Francisco. The Slav and Italian Negro women making bed springs and working sort of industrial work. This last one says laundry and domestic work didn't pay, so they entered the garment trade. So rather than cleaning somebody's clothes, they're actually making clothing and a much better living, which leads to greater independence. So the home front is going to be changed as a result of the war. African American experience is going to be changed, but not all for the positive, as we know. Riots and lynchings increase. Folks come back from the war. Some soldiers get lynched while still wearing their uniforms. They come back. Some folks just don't like how that looks, that image of these upright soldiers, and they get lynched or caught in race riots. 58 African Americans are lynched in 1918, even the war ends. The bloody summer of 1919 is one of the bloodiest in history. So it's interesting to think about the positives and the negatives coming out of this. Very interesting to think about the positives and the negatives coming out of this period. Questions about this? I want you to think specifically about the impact of World War I on the home.